Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. With billionaires continuing to pour cash into fertility technology, we are approaching a world where big tech, big fertility, these concepts and services are intertwined. Eugenics is coming to America wrapped in code words such as optimization and reassurance. I want to talk about what that means for society. We're joined by Patrick Brown, fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where his work with the Life and Family Initiative focuses on developing a robust pro-family economic agenda and supporting families as the cornerstone of a healthy and flourishing society. Patrick, great to speak with you. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great to be on.
Well, I'm very glad to be able to talk about this issue with you. Let's talk about how eugenics has been couched under modern euphemisms and what it has done to the social ethos about life.
Yeah, I think in the popular mindset, when you hear the word eugenics, you often think of, Nazi Germany or the push from here in the U.S., the progressive movement era was all about weeding out the unfit and sterilizing people who were deemed sort of, inappropriate people to have children. Thankfully, that died off. Eugenics, with that sort of coercive mentality of this is something that the state needs to, actively try to guide the human race, that has a pretty bad reputation for understandable reasons. Unfortunately, we're seeing a new version of eugenics creep into the picture, and that is sort of tech-fueled eugenics or Silicon Valley sort of funded eugenics, where it's not about the state or the government trying to choose who is and who isn't able to have kids or who is or isn't able to be born, but it's about putting the power in the hands of consumers and saying, well, here are these new technologies available. We're not going to tell you you have to use them or you don't, or not. But if you do use them, you're able to create an embryo that has the best characteristics imaginable, right? Not just choosing eye color or hair color or what sex it is, but what diseases it might be more or less predisposed to, how it might score on an intelligence test or an SAT test, what kind of athletic ability it has. It's really allowing allowing parents not to inherit children as gifts, but to select them as you might select a product out of a catalog. I think that's a really dangerous future for us to be heading into.
And dangerous is an understatement. I want to ask if you could also speak to the fact that we're gradually sliding more and more towards a society that simply has no regard for the dignity of human person and the human life.
Right. I mean, these technologies are still pretty fringe, which is the only maybe good thing that you can say about them. It's not very common yet, but the problem that we're going to be facing is that what's available to the wealthiest 1% today is going to become widespread consumer technology 10 or 20 years down the road. And I think that if people aren't paying attention to the advances that are happening at a rapid pace, right? It wasn't just, a couple of years ago, we're talking about, we're just, screening fetuses for Down syndrome and you've headlines about countries, quote unquote, curing, or eliminating Down syndrome when it's all about just aborting fetuses that test positive for Down syndrome. Now we have that at a much more granular scale where you can create, companies are now purporting to be able to create dozens of embryos, and then you screen them based on their proprietary algorithmic testing, and they say, well, this one is the one that scores the best, and the other 59, or however many you've created, we'll just put those in the freezer for later or destroy them because they're no longer needed. That's turning the act of procreation from what it should be, the act between a man and woman in the context of marriage, into really a consumeristic mindset. Yeah. And you have single parents, or parents without any relation to the embryo in question at all, who are able to basically go around the world getting genetic material from this country, mixing it with genetic material from that country, hiring a surrogate in a third country. It really becomes eugenics practiced at scale very quickly in a way that I think we should all be very concerned about.
Tell us about the advent of genetic designer babies that some companies are purporting to be able to provide. Uh,
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the last part of that
oh, yeah,
question.
sure.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Tell us about the genetic designer babies that some companies like Herosite are purporting to be able to provide a service for, like expected IQ outcome, eye color, height, that sort of thing.
Right, exactly. So there are companies out there who are offering this service essentially to parents who are, you know, maybe for understandable reasons or maybe for less for less desirable reasons. But if you ask a parent, would you wish that your child would be born with a heart defect or not? Every parent would say, of course not. But most of us treat that as something that is just the luck of the draw. That's just how sometimes your child is born with a disease. Sometimes it's born with a genetic mishap or something. If there's ways we can cure that, that's wonderful. But what these companies are purporting to be able to tell parents is, let's make sure that your child will never be born with one of these diseases. Let's make sure that you're only implanting the embryos that test negative for trisomy 19 or some of these genetically inherited diseases, which can lead to lots of medical expenses and pain and suffering and all the rest. It's turning the relationship between parent and child on its head, essentially, rather than saying, here's the child that God has given us. We're going to welcome it. We're going to care for it. We're going to, even if our heart breaks watching our child, die from pediatric cancer or from heart disease or whatever it happens to be, this is the child that God's given us, and we're going to cherish it and love it as best we can. Instead, these companies are saying, let's look at your genes, let's look at your embryos, let's pick the one that fits your model. It's not about curing an embryo or a baby that has a disease. It's about only selecting the babies to be born that don't have the disease in the first place and condemning the rest of the embryos to a demise, essentially. And that is a new era of sort of consumer-driven eugenics that I think when people hear the sort of glamorous version of this technology on podcasts and on Silicon Valley news outlets and all the rest, they think, oh, wouldn't it be great to have a world free of disease? And again, there's nothing wrong with curing disease, but how you're going about it really matters. It's not about curing disease. It's about only allowing people to be born who are healthy, able, smart, intelligent, athletic, all the rest. That is where the sort of spear's edge of consumer eugenics is right now, and it's only going to continue to grow.
Is there a kind of utilitarian evolutionary superiority philosophy that's driving this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions. I think there are definitely some parents who, are concerned about, oh, what if I'm carrying, the breast cancer gene or something? I don't want to pass that on to my kids. Again, I think that's a misguided sense of what it means to be a parent, but I think they mean well. They just aren't well formed. But there are certainly people out there who are using this technology as a way of trying to breed sort of, superhuman eugenic, or genetic superior, people who resemble it in all sorts of ways. I think you can look at some of the really, in my opinion, kind of gross behavior of people like Elon Musk and Pavel Durov, who's the founder of a big social media networking site in Europe. There's a lot of Chinese billionaires who get involved in this too, who basically hire surrogates or women to have babies for them using their own genetic materials, screening the embryos based on this technology. There's even some who are going to countries where these type of research is legal. In the U.S., this is not legal, but in Saudi Arabia and other countries, it's actually legal to try to splice and dice the embryo to basically enhance it even more. Again, currently that's not allowed in the U.S., but there's people trying to allow that here as well. That is just really about creating a sort of superhuman capability where you're saying, I'm going to take...
Let's pause there, Patrick. The music is hitting. My guest is Patrick Brown, fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We're talking about big tech influencing fertility technology. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Martha Speed. I'm talking with Patrick Brown. He is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and we're talking about big tech influencing fertility technology here in the United States. Patrick, to pick up a theme that you had introduced earlier, you had mentioned that the EPPC had polled citizens, many American citizens, about IVF. Tell me about where they stand, especially in terms of things like sex selection and the knowledge of sex selection in IVF.
Yeah, we did. We asked Americans, a nationally representative sample of adults, basically, what their views were on some of these, especially in the context of all the debate last year around the president's attempt to expand experts around IVF and make that free. We found that most Americans, I'd say, are not particularly well formed when it comes to some of these questions, but they do have some sort of baseline level of uncomfortableness around some of the ways that these technologies are implemented and executed. IVF itself is pretty popular across the nation. About 80% of people support, some level of access to IVF. 2% of all births in the U.S. are via IVF, and that continues to grow. So a lot of people know children who have been born through IVF. But once you start digging into it and say, well, do you have any concerns about how IVF is practiced, the screening of embryos, whether you're screening them based on IQ or sex or all the rest, then people start to have some more concerns, especially older, more religious voters, unsurprisingly, but even some younger voters.
So, Patrick, we're having trouble hearing you. My producer is going to call you back. Like I was mentioning, we were having trouble connecting with Patrick, but I want to continue some of Patrick's thoughts here. According to the EPPC polling, many Americans apparently acknowledge the potential downsides. In fact, roughly 47% of respondents who, in fact, they voted for President Trump in 2024, and even 1/3 of those who didn't, all agree that things like sex selection of embryos during IVF should be illegal. Now, that's quite a leap. That's quite a moral leap. And the reason why that's an important part of this conversation is because, as Patrick was saying earlier, there are many leans, especially religious leans, for why there needs to be a greater regard for the life that is acknowledged in the embryo. Patrick, we have you back now. I want to invite you.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Their big tech doesn't want me to tell you the truth about what's going on here. Clearly.
I know it's a conspiracy.
But no, about 4 in 5 Americans say they have at least some concerns about the way that IVF and some of these practices are implemented. And so that to me is a hopeful sign that we're not, as a nation, we're not ready to just open the door to big tech and big fertility and say, all right, embryos are just a biological byproduct the same way that, a used tissue or a Band-Aid is. We actually should treat this with a little more respect and think about the world that we're entering into when you can predict people's, IQ and health conditions based on their genetic makeup.
I want to invite you, therefore, to speak a little deeper into perhaps a natural religious sentiment that might exist in the minds of the average American populace, even though we live in a decidedly post-Christian era. Is there enough of a basis for us to say that there's some appeal here to a transcendental law that governs human life?
Right. And I think this is where Catholics and believers have sometimes a disconnect from our fellow Americans, because we believe that life begins at conception, where that is an attitude that unfortunately is in the minority. And so there's a lot of people who aren't going to agree with us about the moral value of the embryo itself as much as we wish that we would. We should continue to try to convince them, but they might be more open to the argument that says once you turn human life into a commodity, you open the door to cheapening not just reproduction, but also the entire experience of having a family, being a parent. Once you make human life contingent on whether you pass a certain screen or a certain test or you have certain abilities, you cheapen what it means to become a human. And so I think that's where we have the most
ability to make headway, to say even among people who voted for Vice President Harris in the most recent election, about a third of them had some concerns about screening embryos for depression or creativity. Ableism is a word that gets thrown around a lot among these sort of circles because they're worried about what it does to people who are born with disabilities. Whether you're saying you're worth less than this perfect baby that we've created in a lab somewhere. Having those conversations, yeah, it's tough. We're not always going to agree on the philosophical grounding, but being able to say, look, read 1984 or Brave New World or watch the movie Gattaca. These visions of a world in which people who are deemed unfit or imperfect or no longer welcome. That's not science fiction. That's actually where we could be heading if we don't change the course.
Based on not just your research but also your work, what happens to marriage, family, and society when utilitarian technology takes over this very otherwise personal experience of the begetting of children?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be the great experiment of the next couple of years. I think one thing is to stress is that a lot of people will say, well, we should expand access to IVF because, look at the birth rate and we need more babies, don't we? In every country that you see that has increased public funding for IVF, their birth rate hasn't gone down, it hasn't gone up at all. In many cases, it's gone down. And part of the reason for that is because it sends that signal to people that life isn't about starting a family and finding a partner and having kids. It's about extending, your options for as long as possible. And for a lot of people who wait too long to start IVF, your odds of success are very low. And so part of by turning reproduction into this sort of, science experiment, for lack of a better word. Again, we want to be sensitive to people. A lot of people know people who have gone through IVF or born because of IVF, and we can celebrate that gift of life. But by leaning too hard into the cutting edge of scientific technology, we're taking what should be the product of a husband and a wife and turning it into, two gametes that happen to meet in a cell somewhere. I think that's a dangerous path for us to be going down on. And it also, makes us wonder about, well, what is important about a family after all? If it's just, two people or two people meeting in a lab somewhere, why should we be worried about family life instead of seeing the family as the cornerstone of a healthy society?
As you mentioned, there's very clear moral asymmetry between the religious, the conservative, the progressives on matters of life and the moral worth of the embryo. But are we seeing some shared areas of concern pertaining to, at the very least, the overt involvement of big tech in reproduction?
Not as much as I'd like, but we're working on it. I think you start to see some. There was a high-profile case in Florida just this past week about a couple who gave birth to another couple's embryo. The wrong embryo was implanted, and they welcomed a baby that wasn't genetically related to them in any way. The U.S. is the Wild West when it comes to a lot of this technology, and I think even some progressives who don't have issues with the moral ability of the technology to sort of create children in this way, they would agree that we need to have better regulations around some of this stuff. We should be more sensitive to the concerns of people who can kind of see where this is heading. The fact that we're one of the only nations that allow parents to choose the sex of which embryo they want to implant. That's very uncommon compared to the rest of the world. Some of those sort of more modest guardrails, I could see some bipartisan or cross-partisan support for it if there was
Are there potential undercurrents, social undercurrents, maybe even economic undercurrents and political, that we don't see right now towards this consumer good commodification of children in petri dishes in utero?
It's hard to say. I think so much of this is still in the realm of science fiction for so many people that they don't even know where the technology is and what we can see on the genetic screening and all that sort of thing. I do think we are seeing something of a backlash too. I mentioned President Trump's, campaign pledge to expand access to IVF and some of the steps he did. I do think that was, in some respects unhelpful, but in other respects kind of catalyzed some of the conversation around restorative reproductive medicine and other ways of trying to get to the root causes of infertility to help more people have babies naturally rather than resorting to artificial technology and trying to achieve a child. That conversation continues to happen at the state level. Arkansas passed a bill that's really great. There's federal lawmakers that are talking about more money being spent into these sort of, these are things that across the spectrum, I think people can agree we need more research funding into actually what causes infertility in the first place rather than just try to do an end run with IVF funding. I think that could be the most optimistic, thing that comes out of this. But there's no guarantee that that's where we'll end up.
Is there perhaps a subconscious concern amongst the general populace that big tech is curating its own version of the next generation of human persons and what that might do to society?
Right. And we already know, we've seen what big tech and social media has done to, teenage mental health and the dating scene and, in-person interaction and all the rest. The promises of, mid-2000s, move fast and break things, Silicon Valley technology it came through in ways that nobody could have ever predicted, right? And I think allowing big tech to kind of have that same blank check when it comes to something as intimate and powerful as reproduction, everybody should be able to see the problem there.
I couldn't agree more. Patrick, thank you very much for your time.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
My guest has been Patrick Brown, fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We've been talking about big tech and the continued overt investment in fertility now becoming big fertility and what that's probably going to do to the American society. Stay tuned for the next hour. I'm Marcus Peter.